I think I agree with the assessment that this was a divided result for a divided country. There are certain things that sort of kind of hew to convention, and so the idea that the president's party loses seats in the House of Representatives is not surprising. It also wasn't surprising that Democrats were unable to make gains in the Senate, just given the particularities of this map, right? So there were, too many Democrats coming from vulnerable states who were running at the same time. And so in that respect, it's not terribly surprising that they came up short in this particular election. We also shouldn't be surprised that some of the marquee races were as close as they were, or that the outcomes didn't necessarily work in the ways that people would expect. So in states like Georgia and Texas, the fundamentals still privilege Republicans in the state. And so you have to consider the ways that these candidates came close to winning elections, and Georgia's race is still to be decided. And also keep in mind that what that portends is that while diversity might not be destiny yet, it's moving towards that. And so if it doesn't happen this cycle, if partisan conditions remain the way that they are, we could see these states becoming increasingly competitive in years to come as we see more voters of color entering into the electorate and actually exercising their right to vote. And in Florida, I think there are a couple of lessons to learn. While there were some polls that did actually have a Gillum lead outside of the margin of error, most of the polls were either at or on the margin of error. So you just can't look at the number and say, oh, that number looks big enough, or that number is 1/2 of your confidence interval, and assume that a race isn't statistically tied. So I think we're still misreading polls and expecting that whatever number that they say is the actual number, without recognizing that that number is the midpoint of a range of possible numbers for a candidate. And so people should have gone into this race assuming that the race would be too close to call. Now, scholars will spend the next year or so trying to figure out whether or not people were misrepresenting their votes in polls, whether or not polls had some sampling error in terms of talking to more of one particular demographic than another group of demographic. But in general, I think people sort of put too much stock in polls. Most of the polls point to this being a close election, and the result was in fact a close outcome. And so in that respect, I think in some ways this race actually hews to form. That we're shooting this, Stacey Abrams is waiting for absentee ballots to be counted, and so based on outside reports, there are at least tens of thousands of absentee ballots, and the margin is well within 100,000 at this point. And so what Stacey Abrams hopes is that the absentee ballots break for her, and that ends up dragging Brian Kemp's numbers down below 50%, thus forcing a runoff. So a runoff would be a hard position for her to run in, but she's run a campaign where the primary strategy has been intense voter mobilization, and so she hopes to be able to make up the difference in the second round with intense follow-up with her supporters, and perhaps reaching out to new supporters who didn't participate in this particular election. So I think a recount is likely if that's the case, because if there were a recount, the margin would be within 1 percentage point. I think litigation is actually also a possibility, and so people will be looking to see if there looks like there's any systematic evidence that perhaps there are places where votes were suppressed or people were intimidated or discouraged from voting. And I think it's also possible that there could be a runoff, and so Georgia voters just have to brace themselves for another month of campaigning.